Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
It was good to be able to look out and see everybody here this morning. I wish you were more. But we do encourage you to keep talking about the church and try to invite people to come. I know you do. One of the holidays of the year that I don't like is Labor Day. I don't know how many of you feel the same way. But when I was growing up, Labor Day was not a holiday, it was a work day. First of all, it was the end of summer, because the next day we started back to school. How many of you happen to remember that, by the way? You all are telling your age right now. But this is something. And there was two things I didn't like. First of all, for summer day. And number two, to go back to school, which I hated when I was a kid. But my dad had a practice when my brother and I were in high school. He would have a garden. Now, I said he would have a garden, Victory Garden, that's what he called it. But he would buy the stuff that it was my brother and I that had to put it out and take care of the garden. And all summer long, we would work in that garden. And Labor Day would come. It was the day that we finally took the final harvest, pulled out the tomato plants, pulled all the green tomatoes off. I took them into my mother so she could pick a little. I think that's what she made it up, I'm not sure. We would pull the bean plants up and the corn and everything else. We put them in a compost pile so we could have compost for the next year. Labor Day doesn't hold very many pleasant memories as far as I'm concerned. But it was a day that was set aside in order to be able to honor the American worker. And to this day, I firmly believe that the Americans have the best working staff people in the world. They do a good job with what they do. And they are very, very cautious about this particular holiday that comes up. But Labor Day. The more I thought about Labor Day this coming past week and thought about the idea of what I want to talk about, I want to talk about this more of the congregation, the heart of the people have to work. The idea that we need to get involved with the building of the church, and that we need to be proud of what we do, even as a small congregation. And we need to get involved with the glory of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. When Paul wrote the letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, the Corinth church was a church that was full of problems. I don't think there's a problem church in the United States today that even equal some of the problems they were having. And one of the problems that they had was the idea of the resurrection. Will we raise from the dead? And Paul answered that in the 15th chapter of the book of 1 Corinthians, emphasizing the idea that there is a resurrection. And that resurrection is founded and based upon the idea that Jesus Christ himself rose from the dead. And I like what Paul says. He says, if Christ be not risen from the dead, then our faith is in vain and my preaching is in vain. I told somebody a couple of weeks ago, when I was ready to leave the hospital, that the idea was that I firmly believe in the resurrection. And I told this particular person, it happened to be very close to me, as far as closeness, being near to where I was. In fact, it was my roommate. The idea that we are going to be raised from the dead, there's going to come a judgment, and we're going to have to be ready for that time that Jesus comes back again. But the more I thought about the idea of the resurrection from the dead, the whole idea of what we need to be doing as far as our Christian life is concerned, we as Christians need to set the example for those who are not Christian. I want you to think about that just for a moment. We as Christians need to set the example for those who are not Christian. Many, many years ago, I heard a story. I don't know how true it was. But I have seen similar things happen since this particular time. If my memory serves me right, I was still in college at the time I heard this particular story. About a man that came to church week after week after week after week. And as a person, he never did accept Jesus Christ. Then one Sunday morning, all the clear blue sky, he came forward and was baptized into Christ. So after he was baptized, the preacher says, "What made you come this morning?" He said, "Oh, it was Mrs. Smith down the road. She impressed upon me the need to come." And so the preacher went to Mrs. Smith and said, "What did you say to him? What did you do?" She said, "Well, I hardly know the man. I speak to him, and that's about it. I don't really know him." So he went back to the guy that wasn't a Christian and became a Christian. What in the world did Mrs. Smith do that made you change your mind? And his answer was, he didn't do anything except live a Christian life. And the impact that she made in my life by her Christianity was strong enough that I became a Christian. And I think that's what we need to do. There is a Greek word, and I know you're not scholars, but you're going to have to take my word for this. There is a Greek word that is pronounced tupos, T-U-P-O-S. That Greek word happens to be one of the most interesting words, I think, in the whole New Testament. It is an example. We translate it an example. We translate it as a pattern. We translate it as a print, a form, a figure, a fashion, an example, whatever. And it occurs many times during the writings of the various apostles and the statements that are made. But it's a very, very interesting word in the fact that there are two passages in Scripture that Paul wrote to the young men that were in the ministry, Titus and Timothy. And I think it emphasizes one of the things that we as Christians need to be doing. In Titus, the 2nd chapter, the 7th verse, Paul uses the word Timothy pattern. In 1 Timothy, the 4th chapter, the 12th verse, he used the example of the word as example. Now let's look at this just for a while. In these two examples, one for Titus and the other for Timothy, the whole idea is being expressed that there is a pattern for the Christian to live, and they need to live as an example. In Philippians, the 3rd chapter, one of the passages of Scripture that I hear quite often, Paul says, "I have not apprehended, but this one thing I do, I press toward the mark of a high calling of God in Christ Jesus." Down a few verses from that, 17th verse, I believe, Paul says, "You follow my example, and you mark them that so live, that you will have examples to follow." In other words, Paul was telling Christians, you need to be examples. Now, the word itself is unusual. I I wonder how many of you happen to have a car that has a dent in it. Anybody want to confess? You have a car with a dent in it. How'd that dent get there? It was a hard object hitting another hard object and leaving an impression. When I was preaching in Corbin, I happened to know the sales manager of one of the car agencies in Corbin, Kentucky. They had a car that they were going to junk because nobody wanted it. And it was offered to me at a very, very good price because at the time I blew up the motor that was in my car. It was a Pontiac, and it had 2 bullet holes in it. Now, the car had the bullet holes when I bought the car. I want that to be understood. But the idea that the bullet holes were there, they left an imprint of something that happened to that car. I had no idea what the story was or anything else. But I wonder how many of you happen to remember the old TV series that was called Dragnet. The old TV series that was called Dragnet. At the very end of that program, you see that sweaty hand come up. A stamp in the hand of a sledgehammer, small sledgehammer, hitting and leaving an impression. If my memory serves me right, it was V11, if my memory serves me correct. This is what Paul is saying in Philippians, the 3rd chapter, Timothy, the 4th chapter, Titus, the 2nd chapter, and very often elsewhere in God's Word. When you come in contact with a person who's not a Christian, the example that you set should set a strong impression that that person will be forced to accept Jesus Christ as Savior. That's exactly what it's saying. I have a statement here that I want to emphasize. A Christian should be so Christ-like that when it's bitten by a mosquito, the mosquito would fly away. There's power in the blood. That's the impression we're going to make. We ought to realize that we are the only sermons that a lot of people hear. We are the example that a lot of people follow. And I can remember growing up in the congregation where I grew up in Bellevue, Pennsylvania. And I can remember the people that were there, some of the people that were there, especially one of the doctors that came to the church. And how important their lives were for me because they set the example. 3 passages, all found in 1 Timothy and Titus. I want you to follow me as I read. 1 Timothy, the 4th chapter, verses 6 through 8. If thou put the brethren in remembrance of these things, thou shalt be a good minister of Jesus Christ, nourished up in the words of faith and of good doctrine, whereunto they have attained, that refuse profane and old wives' fables, and exercise thyself rather unto godliness. For bodily exercise profitable little, but godliness is profitable unto all things, being having the promise of the life that now is and that of which is to come. King James Version. I want you to think about that passage of Scripture. The idea that we are to refuse old wives' tales, that we are to refuse fables, and we are to exercise ourselves unto godliness. In other words, we're to build up our spiritual strength, that our lives, being an example, would be known throughout the community. Knowledge of the Word would be required. Prayer warriors how thankful I was for the prayer warriors. I had people all over the world praying for my recovery. Loving one another. Loving one another. Loving our enemies. Preaching the doctrine of Jesus Christ. And doctrine is important. Church attendance. Companions that we choose. Loving one another. Loving God and loving Christ. Overcoming temptation. How important it is that we exercise ourselves unto godliness. Now, I'm going to make a confession here, and Steve's here, and probably, I'm supposed to be doing exercise at home. Steve has bought several pieces of equipment for me. At the hospital, they gave me a piece of equipment that I should be using. I think I exercised one time since I've been home from the hospital. One time. And that was when Steve bought a 3-pound rod of that equipment. I was supposed to use my arms to be able to exercise my arms. I did it one time. I said, oh, that hurts. I'm going to do it again. You know, I'm human. One thing we dare not neglect is to exercise our Christianity and godliness. Paul wrote to Timothy a little bit later on in the 4th chapter of 1 Timothy. Let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example, there's that word typos, of the believers, in word, in conversation or conduct, in charity, in spirit, in faith, in purity. I'm not sure of the thinking of Paul when he wrote it in the Word. Was he talking about the Word of God? He may have been. Was he talking about our honesty, that when we say something, we true to our own word? I don't know. Could be. That was he talking about the conversation, the words that we speak? I really don't know. Kind of feel that it covers all of it. It covers all of it. In conduct, and when you read the word conversation, the old King James, it means conduct, the way you behave. The way you behave. Love. Let your lives be an example of the love that you have one for another. Faith. Attitude. Faith. Clean, living purity. Brethren, you read that list over. If we do this, nobody is going to be able to speak a word against us. Because we are living the example of life for others to follow. In Titus, the 2nd chapter, verses 7 and 8. We read these words, in all things show myself a pattern. There's that word to us again. Of good works. In doctrine, there's that word doctrine. It's important. In doctrine showed uncorruptness, gravity, sincerity. Sound speech that cannot be condemned. That he that is of the contrary part may be ashamed, having no evil thing to speak of you. Doctrine. Saying soberness, seriousness, sincerity, conduct, conversation. How important? How important is this? Many years ago, I was serving a church on a full-time basis. One of the men of the church came to me and says, Bill, I have a good friend. And he says, I would like for you to call this friend. I've been after for years to become a Christian. But they're going through a very ugly divorce. I want you to see what you can do to help them. So I went and called them both of them because they were living in different places at the time. Sat down, and I thought there was some hope there. My kids were yay big. I'm not sure. Steve was with me even in college. I mean, Steve and Mary also may have been in high school at the time, or elementary school. Rick was still a baby. And I had worked with them quite a bit, and I was getting involved with trying to straighten up their problems. And I got a phone call. Phone call was about 11:30 at night. Vera already had the kids in bed, getting ready for school the next morning, and she couldn't leave. And it was the wife of the man I was counseling. I felt she needed to talk to me about what was going on. Normally, under such circumstances, I would take Vera with me, just because of the fact of the propriety of it. But she could not go because the kids were sleeping. So I went down. Several of the church people lived in that same neighborhood. I knocked on the door, and she came out wearing a thin nightgown. Threw her arms around my neck and just slept like a baby. Found out her husband had told her that he didn't want to know more counseling. He was going to go his way. The very first thing I told her to do was to go and get a rope and put a rope on. And one of the church members was looking out the window at the time, in which she threw her arms around my neck and started to weep like a baby. And she started to tell stories about how I was having an affair with this particular woman. I have to honestly admit, it got to me, it made me a little bit angry. However, my reputation in that particular church was so strong that the remarks that were made back to this woman, any other preacher might believe you, but not Phil. Not Phil. He's too dedicated to his wife, to his family. He's too dedicated to the Lord. You're living in a glass house. People are going to look at you and wonder what Christianity means to you. And when they see you living the Christian life, let your life hit them so hard that they have had no choice but to accept Jesus Christ as Savior. That's what we need in our world today. We're going to be singing our song of invitation. Hymn number, I don't even have it with me. What is it?
Just as I am.
Just as I am, I should have known. Just as I am, one verse only. Is anybody here that needs to become a Christian, to rededicate their life, or whatever? We invite you to come as we stand as we sing.